New videos every day.
As science advances, it almost always shows that our original human perspective was incredibly limited and incorrect. So in this video, I'm trying to present a fundamentally different perspective in many ways from what people normally experience. So in the beginning, I raise a lot of technical topics, and it gets a little tedious for some viewers, so please just bear with me until the main points at the end. Also, no matter how many technical points I make, there's still going to be loose ends and objections that people can make. You're welcome to write the objections in the comment section, and I will try to respond in more detail. The first thing I wanted to cover is the fundamental belief that consciousness arises out of matter. In my opinion, this is just a perspective. Science doesn't really have a hypothesis as to how consciousness arises, so it's impossible, in my opinion, to say that science supports consciousness arising from matter. Same way that if you don't have a hypothesis as to how your software is arising on your computer, you really don't know whether it's coming from a server 10,000 miles away or it's coming from your hard drive. You have to have a hypothesis first. It's our natural perspective that we live in a material world, therefore consciousness is arising out of this material world. Absolutely no scientific proof of that, however. In fact, science has been trying for a very long time to prove spontaneous generation. There's no proof of it. On the other hand, almost by accident, modern quantum physics has given some evidence that matter may be produced by consciousness. This is in the quantum eraser version of the double slit experiment. It's still debated, and I'm not a quantum physicist, but at least you could say that many scientists believe that consciousness can give rise to matter, and it is a debated point, whereas no scientists believe that there is any proof that matter can give rise to consciousness. There's certainly a lot of evidence that matter and consciousness are intertwined. So just consider the possibility that matter arises from consciousness, and then the possibility that therefore all matter has an underlying field of consciousness, and also the possibility that you, as part of consciousness, are having some small impact on the physical world around you. Consider the possibility that the entire physical world is somewhat like a feedback mechanism, and you're having some minor impact on that feedback mechanism in your immediate surroundings. Now, you can see this in your interaction with other conscious people. A lot of people that aren't very aware go through life wondering, why is everybody so mean to me? They don't realize that they're just getting feedback from the way they are with everybody else. But consider that the actual physical world, to some slight constrained degree, is just an enormous series of feedback loops. Somewhat like a dream. In your dream, you have no way of knowing that everything is just a feedback mechanism based on your state of consciousness until you wake up, and then you realize, oh, it was just a dream. I'm going to get back to that in a minute, but first I needed to cover another perspective, and that is our perspective within consciousness. We all have the perspective of an individual human being within consciousness. However, again, this is just a perspective. It's not really based on science. Science could just as easily say, I'm a collective hive of hundreds of billions of cells, or I'm one tiny entity, one tiny cell within the organism known as the human race, or within all life on Earth. So there are a lot of perspectives that science could use when viewing life, but your own perspective as an individual human is really just that. It's one perspective within consciousness. So bacteria, for example, have a dualistic state of consciousness at the cellular level, but humans have transcended that, and we have a unified field of consciousness at the cellular level, and at an individual level we're dualistic. And then if you consider the possibility that I discussed earlier of all matter coming from consciousness, consider that if your field of consciousness were unified with an underlying field of consciousness from which all matter comes, then you'd have an even higher state of consciousness. Now, I know I've got to stop for a minute before getting on to the next point, because a lot of people are saying, wait a minute, you've got no proof that consciousness can exist above the level of a human. And I would first say that if you believe that, then you've really got no proof that consciousness can exist at the level of a human mind, except for the fact that you experience it directly. There certainly is proof that collectively the human race has a collective mind. We construct things that no individual human could construct otherwise. But beyond the collective mind that's enabled on the level of the human race by telecommunications and language, or the collective mind that's enabled on the level of the individual by electronic nerve impulses between cells, consider that there's a more fundamental connection between all consciousness. And again, people are saying, well, there's no proof of that. Actually, there is an accepted scientific phenomenon that connects all consciousness irrespective of time and space. And people really resist that statement, but nobody considers that entanglement is an accepted scientific phenomenon, although it's supernatural and unexplained, but it connects matter on a quantum level, irrespective of time and space. So whether you think matter comes from consciousness or consciousness comes from matter, entanglement is the phenomenon which connects all consciousness, irrespective of time and space. On a more immediate level, there's some phenomena in biology as well that are much more simply explained as a connection between consciousness rather than trying to stretch the mechanistic DNA model. Neo-Lamarckianism and the research of Rupert Sheldrake goes into this a lot. But things like instincts and the inheritance of learned behavior, the 100th monkey phenomenon, they are pretty difficult to explain with a purely mechanistic model. And lastly, people say, well, if there's a connection between consciousness, why can't you prove it in a laboratory setting? Consider the Heisenberg principle that you're trying to observe a very subtle effect of consciousness, and yet you have an overpoweringly strong effect of the consciousness of the observer of the experiment, and potentially the future observers of the experiment. I don't mean to turn this into a long debate, though. What I was just trying to do is open people's minds to the possibility that there is a fundamental connection between consciousness. And I'm sure almost everyone has felt this at times. You've felt a more closely unified state of consciousness with another individual or even a group of people. If you were on a team or a band or some group working on a project together, everyone has felt a more unified state of consciousness beyond the individual self. And when people feel this unified state of consciousness beyond themselves, many immediately try to explain it mechanistically by saying that that was just some neurotransmitter in my brain that was giving me that feeling. I'd point out again, first of all, that we don't even have a hypothesis as to how consciousness arises, so to say that we have an explanation for every state of consciousness I don't think is a valid supposition. And secondly, if every state of consciousness could be explained by some kind of neurochemical, then say a drug like LSD should induce the same effect in every individual. Whereas the effects that people can experience from LSD can apparently vary widely. You'll have some people with an extremely expanded state of consciousness, some people with a decreased and paranoid state of consciousness, perhaps partially due to their attachment to duality in the first place. Consider the possibility that your experience within consciousness could simply be a function of your attachment to duality, your attachment to self. In the modern world, a lot of people think that they're honest and they admit that life is simply a nasty, brutish, and short Darwinian struggle. Jack Kerouac put it really well when he said, who's going to come out and say that the mind of nature is innately insane and vicious forever? Or Conrad, who simply said, the horror, the horror. And this isn't a new concept. It's the fundamental concept of samsara in Hinduism, or the first noble truth of Buddhism. This concept of life as an individualistic Darwinian struggle. However, you could just as easily view life as an evolution towards a higher states of consciousness as organisms evolve from single cells to multicellular, and they integrate their state of consciousness. So it's really just a perspective that gives us this view of life as either Darwinian suffering or an integration of consciousness to a higher level. There's a proverb about a man who gets to visit heaven and hell, and first he visits hell and he sees people sitting in front of tables of delicious food, but the people are all starving to death because they've got sticks tied to their arms and they can't bend their elbows to put the food in their mouths. Then the man visits heaven and he sees exactly the same scene. The only difference is that people are picking up the food and putting it in the mouths of their neighbors. The only difference between heaven and hell was the sense of duality that the people had, the sense of self. Consider the possibility that the degree to which you experience life as suffering is the degree to which your consciousness is falling into duality, into separation, and the degree to which you transcend suffering is the degree to which your consciousness transcends duality and integrates into a higher state of consciousness. And people may say, well, that's just your theory, and I experience consciousness the way I do, and there's nothing that can be done about it. Again, I would point out that everyone has experienced a more transcendent state of consciousness at various times in life. The problem is maintaining that state. Think about the possibility that the reason it's difficult to maintain a transcendent state of consciousness is that, as I mentioned earlier in the video, the entire physical world and all of your relationships with everyone else are potentially premised on your previous state of consciousness, which was always dualistic at a certain level. What I'm trying to say is that in order to maintain a higher state of consciousness and transcend suffering, consider that you first have to act based on a sense of unity with other consciousness, with other life. That our previous world and all of our relationships were premised on a sense of duality, and we keep getting feedback from that until we first begin to act based on a sense of unity and gradually overcome that previous feedback. And if you still question all this, just look at the people around you and see who appears most at peace and who appears most unhappy. And you'll often find that there's a direct correlation with their degree of attachment or lack of attachment to duality or self or ego. And then rather than just philosophize about it, do a personal experiment. Go out and help someone or even an animal that has no way of reciprocating so that you're certain it's a selfless act. And see if you don't feel this same sense of transcendence in this same improved state of consciousness.